Welcome to Citizen Talk, the show that takes the most important political topics of the day and breaks them down so we can think about them in a potential way. I'm Juan Davalos.
And I'm Lynette Grunvig, and this is Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. And you can also hear us on SoundCloud or on your podcast app on your iPhone. And we are talking about prudence. So, Juan, why don't you describe what prudence is?
I know, we're the show that's trying to restore prudence to politics. Prudence is just the ability to be able to say to tell what the right thing is to do, considering the circumstances at the right time. So if we want to achieve a particular end, we need to consider what are the circumstances that I need to take into account when achieving that end and making my decision according to those circumstances.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And of course, last week we talked about an issue that involves a great deal of prudence, immigration and immigration reform here in the United States and what that would look like. And there's always been questions about immigration in American history, and it's a very complicated topic. Right,
and we were talking with Dr. Spalding, and one of the questions that we asked him was specifically about different religions when it comes to immigration. Something that the founders say is that you need to consider the different cultures that people have when you consider immigration. And one of the things that Dr. Spalding said was that when you consider about people from a different religion joining a political community, one of the things you need to be careful about or think about is the idea that are they swearing allegiance to a different country or a different political power? And one of the subjects that came up was Islam. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes, we have Mr. Jacob Williams with us. He's a writer living in London, England. And recently he wrote a really fascinating article on First Things called Why I Became a Muslim. And we are very interested to talk to him and ask you, Mr. Williams, since you're a convert to Islam from an English background, how you feel Islam and the West work together, because there's so much conversation about Islam and the West being fundamentally incompatible that I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about that and how you think that they function together.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and may God forgive me if I make any mistakes, as I probably will. But my basic view is that although there are obviously great areas of difference between Islam and the Western tradition, both in a Christian or a post-Christian incarnation, there's also a great deal of common ground and a great deal of potential for mutual benefit, in that Islam has always been able, without compromising its core values of monotheism and obedience to God, to adapt itself to the cultural environments that it's found itself in, and to enhance and benefit from the particular virtues of that culture. And it's my hope and belief that the same thing is possible with Islam in the West.
And so some of the things that you were saying in the article that I found interesting is, first you described that as you saw around your culture, as you saw British culture, there was a feeling of anomie, which it was a new word for me actually, but this feeling that your culture is falling apart, and you said that you turned to education, you pursued some education in philosophy, and then you turned to religion to try to find some grounding for culture that you saw falling apart. So I wonder if you could describe to us a little bit of that, because I think a lot of our listeners would identify with that feeling that your culture is falling apart, and an attempt to try to find some grounding for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it was, I suppose, more a sense that the culture in which I brought up was trading on a already vanished past. The kind of very weak afterglow of Anglican Christianity, with which I was acquainted in ways during my childhood and schooling, just was visibly fading. And the generation I'm part of have almost no real attachment with the religious core and the cultural traditions that were attached to that in the British context. So there was this great sense of emptiness and loss. But it was really only at university when you encounter what is the more determined and ferociously, shall we say, renunciative attitude of modern intellectuals that I began to reflect on this more keenly. And I think it was William Blake who talks about this issue of culture, and he called it the matter of England, because he had this notion that a culture has to be for something. There has to be a purpose to it, and just valuing a culture for its own sake ultimately leads you into a kind of hollow nationalism. So that was what made me feel the only solution was to recover some kind of transcendent core. And so it was through that process of searching for that transcendent core that I came to the state of submission to God, Islam, which is... Yes.
One of the things that you talk about in your experience at the universities in England, you talk about the social justice movement in the university, and you describe them as having a contempt for England that revolted you. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, they have a contempt for everything that is good and beautiful, to put it bluntly. It's a contempt for religion, for the family, for any kind of morality that constrains individual appetites, and part of that is contempt for cultural heritage and for one's nation. Because it seems to me that the kind of underlying belief of the social justice movement, as you call it, is the idea that there must be nothing whatsoever that constrains the individual from pursuing any desire they might happen to have for any reason, and any kind of loyalty to a country or attachment to a culture is a potential threat. So it's a very deracinating movement that holds the traditions of whatever country it finds itself in the greatest contempt.
That's interesting. I think we run into the same problem frequently here in the United States, personally. That has definitely been my experience. And I think a lot of Christians would feel similarly that there has been a degradation in morality and a need to, I don't think Christians tend to use the word submit as much, but in a sense, submit to God and God's will. And that leads me, of course, to wondering, there's a lot of people, in the U.S. that are concerned, I think, that Islam tends towards loyalty to a different set of principles, say, than we do in the United States. And I think I would describe those principles as essentially in the Declaration of Independence: equality, that you have a right, an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so I wonder how you feel like Islam fits. Do you feel like Islam is somehow incompatible maybe with those principles, or could a Muslim swear allegiance to those principles and be a perfectly moral and upstanding Muslim, I guess?
That's a very good question, and it's interesting you quoted that passage in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that part of the inspiration for the document came from John Locke, and that his original formulation was life, liberty, and property. There's a concept in Islamic jurisprudence that there are 5 goals that the Sharia, this phrase Sharia law is actually a silly one because Sharia means law, but there are 5 goals that it tries to pursue, and 2 of them are the preservation of life and property. So there is, I think, more commonality between aspects, at least, of the Western, shall we say, liberal in a very broad sense tradition, and the Islamic one.
Interesting.
One of the things you say on the article that was that the hardest part for you was opening. You'd say, I'm going to quote you: "Opening my heart to the truth of Islam and ceasing to see it as another destabilizing force, alien to the tradition I loved." And then you later go on to say, "My journey toward Islam thus begun, not with a rejection of the Western tradition and inheritance, but with a strong desire to affirm as much of it as might prove compatible with religious truth." So I was curious about that, specifically when you say preserving or affirming as much of Western tradition as is possible. compatible with religious truth. And I'm wondering specifically about those things that you find. Are there things that you find incompatible between Western civilization and Islam that you're having tension with reconciling the two?
Broadly, I'd say no, but it's not so much there are very specific things that are incompatible as that they are cultures that define themselves in part through opposition to each other. At least the Christian West defined itself in part through being the sort of corner of the Eurasian continent in the far northwest that hadn't been conquered by Islam at a certain point in history. And it's I think perhaps more a historic thing that there is a great sense of that identities are kind of constructed in a certain way in order to try to exclude the other. But in general, I think that, well, there's also, of course, the point that obviously if one does change one's religion, there are always going to be things that a certain religion advocates or regards as wrong that another religion or another belief system doesn't. So, of course, there are differences, but to the point of being fundamentally incompatible, I don't think so.
You earlier brought up the subject of Sharia or Islamic law, and so one of the things that we're seeing in the news, and maybe this is just, I rarely trust anything that I hear on the news anymore, but sometimes you hear about certain Islamic populations or groups within cities like London or here in the United States like New York, Chicago, or other places, where groups of Muslims are saying, well, no, we want to live under Islamic law in our place, so we're going to sort of disregard what the laws of your country say, and we're going to start living by Islamic law, and that's the law we're going to enforce here in our community. And I wondered what you thought about that. Is this a group of people that are misinterpreting Islam, or is that actually consistent with what Islam teaches?
Well, one of the things which the Sharia says, or one of the aspects of it, is how to conduct oneself as a religious minority in a non-Muslim land. And one of the fundamental principles of that conduct is to obey the law of the land. So it's an orthodox normative position that Muslims are obliged to obey the law of the land in which they live, whether they happen to approve of it or not. And with regards to this idea of setting up parallel legal systems, this is maybe something which has, I think, been exaggerated in how alien and radical it is. I can't speak for the situation exactly in the United States, but I know that in the UK there have been Jewish religious courts and church courts for some Christian groups who have a certain kind of jurisdiction, a civil jurisdiction, not necessarily directly enforceable, but that they are permitted to give judgments that people can follow if they wish. And this situation isn't something that inherently threatens the legal order of the country it occurs in.
So one issue historically that America has always dealt with immigration is, as we talked about earlier, religion. And of course, historically there was always a question about Catholic immigrants, whether they could be loyal Americans because they owed allegiance to the Pope. And that's largely been settled, I think, now. No one really worries about that anymore. But that often comes up in a similar way with Islam. The question of, can Muslims truly be loyal citizens to, say, the United States if they could potentially owe allegiance to a future caliphate or a future Islamic government that might demand more allegiance even from people living within Western countries? What do you think about that?
Well, it is, as you say, a potential future caliphate, because there is no caliphate in the world, and there is a pope. So it's a very abstract and far-removed question. The governments in the world that are or claim to be Islamic at present, for the most part, oppress their populations, which are Muslim populations. I would say worse than Muslims are oppressed in the Western world. So the extent to which Muslims have some kind of loyalty to support a foreign policy in some kind of hypothetical attack on the West is probably pretty limited. So I think that this issue is, again, probably something that is kind of confected out of a great many confusions and half-truths, and is presented as more worrying than it needs to be. The point about citizenship is interesting. In Britain, until very recently, there was really no such thing as a citizen. We were subjects of the crown. The idea being that you had an obligation to obey the law of the land, but it wasn't seen as a contract. So that's a problem that manifests itself differently in different countries. In general, there is no reason that a Muslim, I think, cannot regard the political and legal institutions of the United States as acceptable in the sense that they ought to be obeyed and the law followed, in the same way in which members of other religious groups who have their own vision of law, like halakha in the Jewish tradition, or the principles of canon law in a certain Christian tradition, might also resolve that potential conflict.
Yeah, that I think that's a valid point. There is no caliphate currently, and that's very true. I do wonder, though. Let's say you're a Shiite Muslim, and you have loyalty to the Ayatollah and maybe the Iranian regime. You see that as more of a. I mean, would you say that in that case there might be a possibility that someone would feel more loyalty to, say, the current Iranian regime than the Western regimes as they currently exist?
I'm not a Shia, and I don't know that much about the details of Shia political theology, so I couldn't exactly comment on that one. Yes, I couldn't exactly comment on the situation of Shia groups.
Well, when I feel like when a lot of people hear about Islam, and this may be an incorrect impression, I don't know, and that's why we're talking to you, but a lot of the things we hear is that, you know, a lot of Muslim countries have things such as female genital mutilation or honor killings or forced marriages, and so a lot of people hear those things and they obviously feel, well, those things are incompatible with the way that we think humans should conduct themselves. Or, for example, the treatment of women, where in countries like Saudi Arabia, women can't drive, or things like that. Or we see women that cover themselves completely in a burqa, or, you know, those things, I think, tend to go against the idea in, like we said, Western civilization, that there's a certain equality of all human beings. And sure, if you want to say, you know, women should be modest, that seems to be different than saying, well, women should cover themselves completely in public, or they aren't allowed to drive, or things like that. So I was wondering what you thought about those things, and how you are they inherent in Islam, or are they misinterpretations of it? What do you think about that?
The short answer is they're not inherent in Islam. Female genital mutilation is a hideous abomination, at least in the. I mean, there is some issue that I believe there's some distinction between female circumcision and female genital mutilation, which is not really made in Western medical discourse, and there are some very mild, non-invasive kinds. But what you think of when you think of female genital mutilation is a hideous abomination, and although some Muslim scholars have at some points endorsed it, it's not part of our religion that scholars can never be wrong. So that's, I mean, I wholly agree with you about that. Forced marriage is pretty much condemned by Orthodox Islam. One of the principles, that the fundamental conditions of a valid marriage in Orthodox Islam is that the woman has to consent. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia follows a very, very puritanical minority form of quite, paradoxically, it's quite modernist. It's Wahhabism, the term you may have heard of, which was a doctrine developed in the 18th century, partly in response, actually, to the pressures of encountering the modern West in the Arabian Peninsula. And it's pretty much disapproved of by the great majority of Muslim scholars, and the extreme conservative principles upheld by the Saudi state, though perhaps for how much longer? It seems that the new regime are trying to turn it into a sort of playground for libertine global elite. But
and Jacob, sorry to interrupt you. We have a short break.
I would just say that those things are very much a minority position and not a normative one, or one that I would endorse.
Sure. We have a short break coming up. We're having a fascinating discussion with Jacob Williams. He's a writer living in London, England. He wrote for First Things an article entitled "Why I Became a Muslim," and we're trying to understand with him whether Islam is compatible with Western civilization. You're listening to Citizen Talk. I'm Juan Dávalos.
And I'm Lynette Grunvig, and this is Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM, and you can also hear us on SoundCloud or iTunes.
We'll be right back after the break.
Hello and welcome back to Citizen Talk. This is the show that deals with current affairs in a prudential way. I'm Lynette Grunvig.
And I'm Juan Dávalos, and you're listening to Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM.
And you can also hear us on your SoundCloud app or your iTunes app, and just search for us, Citizen Talk, all one word, and we're also on YouTube now.
And we're talking with Jacob Williams. He wrote an article recently in First Things entitled "Why I Became a Muslim." And one of the things that drove him to becoming a Muslim is seeing basically the cultural decay in the UK, especially in the university, where there is basically no moral standard. It's all a pursuit of pleasure, of doing whatever you want. And he believes that he found the antidote to that in Islam. And so we're talking to him about that and why he believes that Islam can be a antidote to the decay of Western civilization, and why it can be actually compatible with Western civilization. And one of the things that we were talking before the break is certain of the more controversial things we hear about Islam in the news, especially certain practices such as forced marriages or female genital mutilation. And Jacob, what I wanted to ask you was, so even though you might say, well, certain of these practices are not actually inherent in Islam, is people acting against what Islam actually teaches, why do you think it is that certain of these practices are so prevalent in Muslim majority countries, especially I would say the treatment of women or of gays or of different people that, I'm not saying you need to embrace everything that everybody does, but to a certain degree, you try to respect their rights as much as you can. And that doesn't seem to be happening in Muslim countries.
Well, one answer is because they're poor and dysfunctional and badly governed. Another answer would be that it's because Islam has preserved the original. Charles Taylor, who's written this massive book on the secular West, has a very nice phrase, the social imaginary. It's the kind of subconscious or pre-rational way in which people envisage a community. And Islam has preserved the original social imaginary far more than any other global civilization. So one of the unfortunate implications of that is that it also preserves some of the diseases that have crept in to certain local cultures, such as female genital mutilation or forced marriage, which are abhorrent practices and evil practices. But these things are preserved, and they are attached to a certain interpretation of Islam in some local communities. The positive side of the fact that Islam has preserved its original vision is that it's also much less prone than other global religions, particularly Christianity in the West, to selling out and becoming just another kind of cookie-cutter liberal faith that doesn't really challenge any of your preconceived moral opinions. So it's a very difficult situation, but the simple answer is that most of the things you mention are, they are not supposed to be preserved. So they've been preserved despite the teachings of Islam, not because of them.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm curious to go back a little bit to the idea that Islam can act as a sort of antidote to the corruption of Western civilization, and I think a lot of Americans feel similarly. I would say the United States, much more so maybe even than Europe right now, was a divided country. You have about half the population voting for President Trump, about half voted for Clinton, about half voted for President Obama, about half voted for Romney. And so there is a strong conservative core still in the United States, a core that would like to see, I think, a resurgence of a more moral culture, and then another very differing core in the United States too. And there is a very clear divide currently, I would say, in the U.S. And so I think a lot of Christians would say, yes, we would love to see God's law, God's will taken more seriously in people's individual lives. And so you say that you didn't find that answer in Christianity, but you did find it more clearly in Islam with the idea that God, there is no Son of God. God is just one. He's purely universal, and so there's no division there. And I'm curious how you feel Islam maybe better answers the question of moral decay than you felt like Christianity did.
Well, you touched on the theological point, which is, of course, the important one, the most important one, that God is one. That's the fundamental belief of Islam, and that's what attracted me to it, that there is no sense that God's perfection could be compromised through a becoming physical, becoming part of this sundered reality. And I think that actually that core principle is maybe part of the reason that it has been able to preserve traditional teachings, those which are the true teachings of Islam, those traditional teachings better than Christianity, because the idea of God being one, it is one of the simplest, most intuitive doctrines that has ever been pronounced by any human. And it has this great power to maintain itself in the face of all the threats to faith which the modern world poses, which Christianity, for the most part, has not been able to do, especially in Europe, to a lesser extent in the United States. So it was partly my experience of a range of different Christian denominations in the UK that all of them seemed to be in a state of compromise and retreat. And ultimately, I attributed this to their having a theology which was less able to sustain itself in the face of the long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, in the face of all of the problems of the modern world.
Now, something that I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about, because and I really don't mean to come across as disrespectful here, but one of the things that troubled me in Islam, as the little I've studied it, is some of the things surrounding the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Specifically, I believe that when Islam started, he extended the religion through war and violence, and some of the things such as one of his wives being a 9-year-old girl essentially. So those are some of the things that I find troubling, and also some of the things in the Quran. There's a couple of surahs that talk about really promoting violence and I think I have it here, Surah 9:5. I have, but when the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them. And so things like that I find troubling about the religion, and I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
That's, thank you for raising those points. So let's go through them one at a time. So the issue of violence and studying religion through war. Okay, now, if by studying religion through war you mean that Islam forced people to convert, then that's just false. It's just 100% false. It was never supposed to happen. It's never been a teaching of any significant group of Muslims. It's never been promoted on a large scale by any of the major Muslim polities. It's completely antithetical to Islam. You can't force people to convert.
What about the tax? The tax on non-Muslims that Muslim countries put?
Okay, so I'm coming to that. So if by that you mean extending a political regime based on the principles of Islam, one of which is, as you say, that non-Muslim religions have the right to practice their faith, but they also have to pay a tax in return for their protection under the law. Well, they are also, interestingly enough, exempt from military service under the traditional Muslim policies. And, one can say that is simply that, yes, I mean, this idea of a tax doesn't fit perfectly the modern conception of the state, but it is far closer to equality, if you like, and I'm not saying that should be the ideal, but it is far closer to equality than how non-Christians were treated in Christian lands until a couple of centuries ago, until extremely recently. So you also mentioned the age of one of the Prophet's wives, peace be upon him, Aisha. So there's some debate as to whether she was really 9 years old, but assuming that she was, it's very interesting that the first time this was ever actually picked up on by a Western scholar, and there have been so many Western scholars attacking Islam, but the first time one chose to attack it for that reason was in around 1900. So that's 1,200 years, or nearly 1,300 years after the inception of the Mohammedan tradition. Well, why did no one pick up on this until then? Because it was more or less a universal practice. The common law age of marriage was about 12 or 13 in England until it began to change in the 19th century. It was only with the onset of industrialization and then later changes that we developed this moral prohibition against young marriage. So now, I'm not saying that it's appropriate to marry 9-year-old girls in the modern situation, but this idea that Islam has some kind of special problem with condoning that, when it was actually the universal practice of all cultures, because people matured faster, and there was just this moral idea that you don't become an adult until 10 years after puberty didn't exist. That's a misguided one. I think it's a really confused and misguided one. And if I could also just pick up on the point about killing all the pagans. So, it's interesting. That surah says that, yes, but you can find verses in the Bible that also appear to endorse hideous violence. And if you take them out of context, you'll find yourself believing that Christianity is also, as some people believe about Islam, a genocidal sect. So picking up isolated verses doesn't really fly.
Right, and so
if you look at what Muslims actually did, if I could just
go ahead.
That one. If you look at what they actually did, so when Muslims conquered India, which of course was and still is pagan, there was a pact whereby the pagans were made people of the book, meaning they had all the privileges, or nearly all the privileges, of Christians and Jews in the Islamic regime, and they were given more or less perfect liberty to practice their faith. So pretty much all of those accusations don't actually stand up to scrutiny.
Right, and so actually that's a question I've always had about the Quran. Right, you talked about the Bible, how people can take certain verses out of context, and I completely agree with you. However, one of the things that you learn from the Bible is that different books have different genres of literature. So some are historical books, and a lot of the books in which you find things as God telling the people of Israel to go to Canaan and killing all the inhabitants, even the animals, like completely annihilate them. You say, yes, okay, that sounds like a horrible thing, but it was a specific command given to a specific people at a specific time and place, and no Christian would read that as a historical account and say, God is telling me to do that right now, or at least no Christian would properly read that from the Bible. And so my question, since I'm very ignorant on how the Quran is written and how it's structured, when I read a surah like that, is it because it's part of a particular command that was given to a people in a certain place and time, or are those more general sayings that anybody can read now, as sort of like a proverb, and apply them to their life today?
The first suggestion is closer to the truth. So the notion is that the Quran is the speech of God. So there is a sense that it's all a direct revelation, but there are many principles governing the interpretation. So, for instance, some surahs are abrogated by later ones. So you read something saying do this, and then later on God says actually do that, and it's as it were cancelled out. And there are also some which were commands to that particular community of people in that particular conflict at that time. So broadly speaking, yeah, your first suggestion is right, that not every injunction in it is a universal injunction for people to follow right now.
So I've heard, and you can correct me whether this is right or wrong, I've heard that some Islamic scholars feel like the more violent sounding surahs tend to come later, and so actually to some degree supersede the more peaceful ones. I'm actually very interested in what you think, because this is something that I think I've heard a lot from various different people, and so I'd be very interested what you would say to that.
Yes, I've also heard that one a lot, and like many of these things, it's a very dangerous mix of truth and falsehood. So rather than engaging in the exegesis of the Quran, which I'm not qualified to do, it might be more informative if I sort of explained the traditional Islamic view on war. So there are four schools of jurisprudence in Islam, in Sunni Islam, and God forgive me if I make a mistake, but the traditional position was among three of them that war may only be fought for an aggressive purpose if two conditions hold. That firstly, it can be fought with very little loss of innocent life, and secondly, that it is to liberate people from oppression. So the majority view was actually quite constraining, and it had a developed theory of just war, pretty analogous in lots of ways to the Christian development of just war theory at around the same time. Now, today, the position is actually even more pacifistic, because the distinction between the domain of Islam and what they called the domain of war, not the domain of constant war, but the domain of where war may be appropriate sometimes, no longer really holds, because we don't live in a world in which there is one area in which precepts of Islam are broadly upheld by the state. They're very, very badly upheld in a very fragmented and incoherent way, and the modern state is very different to a traditional Islamic policy anyway, and another area of the world in which Islam is persecuted. Because as I said earlier, Muslims are often better treated by supposedly unbelieving governments in the West than by their own supposedly Muslim governments. So the whole system, the classical scholarly system, which was itself not as bellicose as is usually thought by any stretch of the imagination, probably doesn't apply in the modern world. And that, I think, is the opinion of, to my knowledge, most of the Orthodox scholars. So so rather than try to explain every single surah that appears to be violent, I think looking at the general legal position is far more informative, and it isn't what one what one hears.
Right. Now, we're almost out of time, so I do want to thank you for being with us. I had one last question, and I wanted to go back to a point that we mentioned earlier, because the crux of the matter, at least what we try to do in this show, is try to find out if certain ideas or things like that are compatible with Western civilization, because we want to be good citizens of, in our case, of the United States. And so one of the things that we talked about earlier is, well, do Muslims owe allegiance to another political community? And you say, well, obviously, of course, right now there is no caliphate, but it is possible, or at least Muslims look forward to, if I'm correct, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, they do look forward to a caliphate in the future. And I'm guessing they would want that to come about. And so what happens to Muslims who are citizens of different countries around the world at that point? Do they owe allegiance to that Islamic caliphate?
Well, that is a question you'd have to ask an expert in political jurisprudence. One general point I'd make, though, is that the idea that the political community is the thing that should define or the thing that should be the locus of our sense of particularity and the attachment that follows from that is one that I think is probably a pretty flawed one, because especially actually in the Christian tradition, there is this sense that politics is something less than sacred, and give unto God what is God, to Caesar what is Caesar's. So the idea that we should treat political allegiance and attachment to the nation state as a sacred value is, I think, a flawed one. And I prefer a more organic type of patriotism, where we may have an attachment to our land, to the culture and customs that come with it, but the kind of absolutist loyalty to a particular state is something of less inherent value.
Well, and I believe that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Jacob, for being our guest today, guest of Citizen Talk. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Well, that's been a great discussion, Lynette, and I think that last question for me is the one that really needs to be answered. Can you owe political allegiance to the country you're in? Because if there's a future caliphate one day and that caliphate decides to take some policies contrary to the United States, well, what would those Muslim citizens of the United States do? Will they listen to that Muslim caliphate, or will they be loyal to the United States? You can't have your loyalties divided.
Yeah, I think that's a question that has been asked for a long time. John Locke, in the Letter Concerning Toleration, always believed in religious toleration, but was concerned about the idea of a religion having loyalty to a foreign power or a foreign state, and that John Locke actually thought maybe you should restrict, because you need to have people who are loyal to your own state. The founders tended to be pretty tolerant, generally speaking, of religion across the board. They were not as concerned with this issue overall, I think. So there's a lot to be discussed there.
Yeah, and I think it's one of his last points, which was, what do you hold ultimate allegiance to, your country or your faith? Personally, that's why I guess I am a Christian, thankfully, actually, because I believe Christianity is true, but thankfully I don't see a conflict between those two in Christianity.
Yeah.
But it's been a great discussion.
Yeah, very
You're
interesting.
listening to Citizen Talk, the show that's restoring prudence to politics. I'm Juan Dávalos.
And I'm Lynette Grunvig, and this is Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. And you can also hear us on SoundCloud or on your iTunes app. Just search for us, one word, Citizen Talk, and you can also find us on YouTube.